Okay, so let me just say a little bit about women's arousal and then a bit about female orgasm and some of the challenges that women and couples can have around orgasm. The first thing I would say is that, for those of you who have taken my Art of Desire course, this you will understand, but women's arousal is highly connected to their experience of freedom. And so to be sexual, a woman wants to feel free. And when she feels free in her sexuality, it's a place she'll want to go. A lot of people create sexual relational realities in which the woman is not free, that she is taking care of her husband's sexual needs, that she is managing his sense of self by giving him the sex that he wants, that she feels that if she's sexual, she is less of a woman, or in some way unrighteous, or some way less virtuous. And so to be sexual then is to lose something of yourself. And so that's very, very important, because a lot of women and men have been enculturated into sexuality in a way where there is a real ambivalence about being sexual, because there's a question of whether or not that is creating something better in your life or constricting your life more. For example, people who have come out of sexual trauma are not going to want to be sexual if it represents constriction, loss of self, that when the meanings, if you feel like this is your marital duty, you're not going to want to be sexual. If you think having an orgasm is a way of kind of being gross or somehow losing control of yourself or embarrassing, you're not going to want to orgasm, because again, it's connected to losing yourself and losing your sense of freedom. So growing out of this reflected sense of self, or this idea of who you're supposed to be for others, and moving into a deeper relationship with your sense of self, your sexuality, your embodiment, is extremely important for having the kind of emotional and psychological foundation for being a woman who can be sexual and free, can really belong to herself, can express herself freely in the marriage. And again, just like a lot of women are trying to have an orgasm, but their minds are weighed down with not only conflicted meanings, like, if I do have an orgasm, then am I obligated to my husband all the time? Or does this make me somehow the wrong kind of woman? Or my mother never liked sex. If I like it, am I somehow betraying who I'm supposed to be? So women can be in those meanings, sometimes not knowing that they are, and then be judging themselves the whole time that they're not able to orgasm. And so when you're in a lot of judgment of self like that, it becomes very, very, it's a suppressing reality. It's putting the brakes on orgasm, because there's so much harshness and anxiety that's a part of it. So I think that's what, I'll just start with that idea of arousal. I'll say more about women's arousal, but one thing is that, well, I'll say this one thought first, is that in line with that sense of freedom, who you are in your relationship is really critical. So if you've created a relationship with your spouse where you feel free to be who you are, free to show your strength, free to show your autonomy, to be honest, well, then it's not so hard then to show up and express and show your sexuality. If though you feel not free in your relationship, where you're supposed to be taking care of him psychologically or sexually, or you feel like he's somebody you have to kind of hide your history or hide the core of who you are from, well, then it's very hard to have your sexuality show up in any authentic way, or any way that's linked to a sense of freedom when you're with your partner. And then it becomes much easier to just kind of try to get through the act or try to accommodate, rather than really being free within yourself. And this isn't just what a husband does to a wife. This is also what a wife does to herself. How does she relate to her autonomy? How does she relate to her sense of self? So some of these things will come up in the questions, and I'll say more about them. So this person writes, I'm not I'm just not sure if I'm having orgasms. People keep saying that you know it when you have one, but I'm not sure I believe it. I've never felt vaginal contractions, and I think those are a pretty basic part of it. I can really enjoy what's happening, and there is a climax, but I don't know if it's the climax. And I don't ever feel happy to be done until next time, relaxed, etc. Is that a myth? What is afterglow anyway? My experience doesn't seem to fit the description of an orgasm, but I also reach a really good part and then I'm done. Sensitive or painful with more stimulation starts to happen. Couldn't start over again even if I really want to. I've been frustrated our whole marriage, like I'm feeling around in the dark, but I don't know what I'm looking for. Okay, good. So let me just say first a little bit about what is orgasm and how do you know if you're there. So when you orgasm, first of all, again, if you've taken some of the courses, you know this, but there is a arousal threshold and an orgasm threshold. And with enough psychological and physical stimulation, you'll cross over the arousal threshold. If you're a woman, the way you know you've crossed that arousal threshold is that blood flow starts to increase to your genitals, your heart rate starts to increase, your breathing starts to become quicker, your nipples may become more erect, so you're aroused. With ongoing and continued stimulation, psychological and sexual, so good high quality and quantity of stimulation, you will eventually reach the orgasm threshold. And the orgasm threshold, you can't control it, right? So anytime you're trying to control having an orgasm, you may be working the wrong muscle, which is different than wanting to have one and working to have one. But it's getting enough stimulation that you go over that threshold and then you experience this very positive reflex in your body. What always works, there are breaks and things that work against orgasm, and particularly female orgasm, because women are particularly sensitized as a function of being a female, because it's biologically vulnerable to reproduce, to be pretty sensitive to whether or not this is a good context in which to be sexual. And is it a place in which they feel free to be themselves, or is it a place in which they feel more constricted? So when you have crossed over that orgasm threshold, basically you start feeling the clenching right before, where there's sort of much more intensity of tension within your muscles. And then you'll feel your genitals start to contract. And there is a release of that tension that you've been building up to. And that's part of the pleasure, is there in arousal, you're building up more and more and more tension. The better the orgasm, the more tension that has been built up and the more of a deep and full release. What I think, and then there's a huge dose of oxytocin and dopamine, and I think what a lot of people experience as the afterglow is that flood of oxytocin, that flood of dopamine, those feel-good feelings. And especially if you have a kind and good spouse who is scratching your back afterwards and is holding you, there's a sense of pleasure of this is a loving relationship, this is a place I'm cared about, coupled with that flood of positive emotion. So that's what people mean by the afterglow. So what I think makes this question confusing sometimes for people is that they don't feel a lot of release, or they maybe feel a little bit of genital contraction, but it's not really positive. It still feels kind of tense. They may still feel, maybe they feel some release, but they didn't have this sort of full flood of positive emotion or a real strong sense of release. And first of all, I would say everybody's experience of orgasm is different. If you read, people's different descriptions, people have a pretty broad range of kind of how they experience orgasm itself. Some people feel much more kind of pelvic contraction. Some people feel a lot of like almost convulsions. Some people feel so kind of overwhelmed that they are emotional or may cry. But what this person's question sounds like to me a bit is that she may be handling enough anxiety and kind of fear that there's a kind of a break on, even though she is getting over that orgasm threshold. So she's getting over it, but it's not like this full relaxation, that she hasn't sort of learned how to fully relax herself into that pleasure yet. And so what I would say is very possible is that it sounds like she's having an orgasm, especially if she's feeling like she doesn't really have the desire to continue, that there has been a sort of drop in energy. It feels like she's done, her clitoris is more sensitive. So she may be, has climaxed, but it's just not the pleasure and the kind of deep release that she's hoping for or wanting. What I would say about that is that three things maybe. If she were my client, I would be wanting to talk to her about sort of two different dimensions. I would be interested in how free does she feel just in her life, in her partnership, within herself. How much room is she able to make psychologically for who she is, for her sexuality? Does she have an ambivalent relationship to sexuality, to her ability to thrive in her marriage? Because when I see clients who haven't yet learned how to be free, that they feel really weighed down by shoulds and how they're supposed to be as a partner and how they're supposed, that they're deeply in this reflected sense of self, that's the starting point. That's really important to address before there's any focus on how to have a better orgasm. So I would be interested in that element and what being sexual might mean for her, given her history, or how she's interpreted and taken in some of the teachings that she's had around sexuality. The second area of focus is what's the kind of quality and quantity of the sexual stimulation that you're getting. And one of the things that I teach women and men is how to get your body to be more able to integrate more sexual arousal. And so a lot of men, the equivalent, I think, for men of not being able to orgasm, well, some men have that trouble too, where they have delayed orgasm and they can't get to that threshold. But the more kind of immediate equivalent for men as women that have difficulty with orgasm is premature ejaculation. So when men feel a lot of anxiety around sexuality, that tends to increase their stimulation and actually makes them reach that threshold sooner than they want to. And it's also not very pleasurable because it's anxiety filled. So they may reach it, they may ejaculate, but they're not having that deep embodied pleasurable experience that this person writing the question also wants to be having. There's too much anxiety in the relationship. There's too much performance anxiety often for men and women around their sexuality. This is more of a stage than it is a place to really be sensual and intimate and knowable and in a kind of sexual friendship. It's too linked to proving oneself or not being defective or not disappointing the other person. When women are thinking, he feels so bad. Sorry, I'm just gonna make sure picking up this train going by. That he feels so bad if I don't have an orgasm, for example. That is, those are the kinds of things that will put pressure, increase anxiety, and decrease pleasure. So one way to work with men and women around that is, first of all, to take off the table the idea of performance, that your body's going to do what it's going to do when you don't really have control over what your body does. So don't measure yourself by that. But to focus on who you're being when you're being sexual together. How are you in relationship to yourself? How are you in relationship to your partner? And that one way so just that alone, if you can take the performance anxiety down, make more room for your humanity, make more room for your spouse's humanity without taking those things personally, you start to create more of a psychological foundation in which you can work with your body and work with each other and create more intimacy, just as a function of allowing yourself to show up honestly, even if your body disappoints you. The other thing you can do is work together to build up enough tension through good stimulation and also thinking about what's in your mind, which I can talk about in a minute, to get closer to that orgasm threshold without going over the threshold. So letting yourself get close to that, and then if you're a man and you have premature ejaculation, to squeeze the head of the penis and stop yourself from continuing in that direction, and then integrate that into your body. Take that tension away from the phallus and integrate it throughout your body. For a woman, it's the same. If you're getting closer, you can do the equivalent of squeezing, which is grounding. You're kind of pushing on that pelvic bone and pushing that away from the genitals and into the body, which maybe sounds a little counterintuitive, like I'm trying to learn to have an orgasm, not stop one. Okay, but if you can stop it and then integrate that more into the whole body, right, then you're holding more tension in the entirety of your body. And then the goal is to then move back up towards that orgasm threshold and then pull back from it again in the same way. And this will help men to not have so much trouble with PE, but also helps women to increase the amount of tension in their body and to have just much more significant orgasms, both because they're integrating more tension, but also because they're operating in a more collaborative way. It takes more willingness to be comfortable with your sexual nature if you're actually, overtly working together with your spouse to create something. So let me just see if people have questions about that before I go on to other questions. This person says, I know I had orgasms when I was first married. I've not in over 10 years. I have a buildup and feel arousal, but then it goes away quickly and won't continue to increase to orgasm. So what I would be thinking about, I don't know all the answers, obviously, with that little of information, but what I would be thinking about is, what do I think has shifted in the meaning? Because, as you've probably heard me say, that your mind is the most important sexual organ. And so usually what happens when somebody, I've had lots of clients who had orgasms when they were dating. They maybe felt terribly guilty about it. They maybe even felt like they were really bad people for having those orgasms. And then when they got married, their sexuality really quite literally shut down. And oftentimes, again, it's connected to, okay, well, I believe in marriage, sexuality belongs to my husband, and if I'm going to be a good woman, I shouldn't have those feelings, so shut those feelings down. Or if I'm going to be safe here, don't really show up sexually, just show up in an accommodating way. So, or is it that resentment started to build up? Is it that, you felt less free to be who you are? So it's just important to think about, there's something going on sorry, I'm seeing the questions here now. So figuring out what are there some meanings that are suppressing my desire? And I'll talk about in a minute. One of the ways you can work with this is to spend time with yourself, especially if being with your partner is increasing your anxiety and making it hard to sort out who you are and how your body works. But I'll say more about that in a minute. Is the only way to improve PE squeezing the head? No, it's also about, that's just a strategy for helping the body to integrate more pleasure. Lots of people address PE by doing things that desensitize the phallus, like getting condoms that are very thick or that have benzocaine spray that reduce sensation, or they think about, their grandmother watching them have sex, or something that is anti-arousing. But the problem with that is that it takes, you have to reduce sensation in order to last longer, and reduce connection. And I think a much better strategy is increasing your capacity to be in connection and to have pleasure without orgasming. So a lot of tantric practices that are very good for men and women are about incorporating more pleasure without rushing to the finish line or thinking the finish line is the measure of the couple or of the self. And so when you learn how to live in that pre-orgasmic state more and create more, so that's a real, so it's just a way of learning how to handle more tension without orgasm. Okay, let me just see. What types of clitoral stimulation do you suggest once things become overly sensitive to touch? Good question. Well, that's a good question. So you can do it in a few ways. One is that, first of all, using lubricant can help to minimize clitoral sensitivity. So a lot of women like lubricant on the outside as just a way of giving their clitoris a bit of a shield from friction. And also sometimes women will use like a sheet or something that just makes the clitoris not get that direct contact and direct stimulation, because they're still able to take in a lot of positive tension. The other way you can stimulate the clitoris is through the clitoral roots. And so because what people think of as the clitoris is usually just the head of the clitoris, it's the equivalent of the head of the penis. The clitoral, when in utero, that fetus has sort of nondescript genitals. If it's a girl, something that looks phallus-like turns into the clitoris, and for the boy it turns into the penis, and they're very similar structures. So just like for the man, the head of the penis is the most sensitive. The head of the clitoris is the most sensitive. It's the part you can see this between the labia. It's the most obvious part, but it's literally the tip of the iceberg. And so you have the clitoral roots that wrap around the vaginal opening and around the walls of the vagina. So that's all very sensitive as well. That's like the shaft of the penis. And so also the cervix can be sensitive for some women and be a positive source of stimulation. So a lot of times women are looking for that clitoral stimulation, but that is not directly connected to the clitoral head. So that can be the inner labia, for example, or inside the vagina at the G spot, which is, I don't know if you can see this, but here's like the vaginal walls, and the G spot is sort of on the upper part here. And so stimulating in the interior of the clitoris is a positive way. Focusing on the clitoral head as the woman gets more and more aroused, then she can take more direct touch and impact. One thing to speak to women's arousal for a minute is that because women are more vulnerable biologically, women, while they are as sexual as men are and are aroused quite easily and with some research more easily than men are, but women, where they're different, is they're much pickier about when to have sex, because they are vulnerable to producing offspring. And so you want to make sure the person you're opening your body and mind up to is in it for the long haul, cares about you. And so women are much more accustomed to mapping the partner they're with and deciding if it's good judgment to be sexual with him. This has a lot to do with the man, of course, but it also has a lot to do with the woman and whether or not she trusts herself in a relationship, whether or not she trusts herself to take good care of herself in her relationships, because the less she trusts herself, the less open she's going to be, no matter who the man is, right? But one way of mapping the man is through the way he kisses, the way he touches her. And so I think this is sort of part of women's biological programming, is that their whole body is their erogenous zone. And so sometimes men get to the point, so to speak, way too quickly. And while touching the clitoris is good, in a beginning of arousal, you want to stay focused on the other parts, and only as arousal increases, put more and more focus on the clitoris. So it's a way of not overworking the clitoris and engaging in a lot of sensual touch and a lot of, like when I was dating John, we were pretty conservative in our behavior, but he would touch me all the time, touch my hair, touch my neck. And again, a woman's whole body is her erogenous zone. So I'd be like, oh my gosh, like, because he would touch me so much, it was so arousing all the time, even though it was technically, legit. And so my point is, like, men would do well to do a lot of that sensual lovemaking through the rest of the body. Right? Because a way to a woman's vagina is through her head and her heart, and knowing and mapping you as somebody who cares about her. But it's also really a big part of arousal, also integrating arousal. So maybe she has some direct clitoral stimulation, but then that is focusing on the rest of her body, integrating that into her body, building up that sort of full body tension. Then those orgasms are intense and a deep release when you are in a partnership where you work together, that you can build up a lot of that sexual energy and tension throughout the whole body. Um, okay, let's see. Um, yes, he should take the men's course that is now available online, because I do a lot to help men to look at the emotional aspects of premature ejaculation as well as the psychological and relational aspects of it. Did I say that twice? The physical parts of it and also the psychological parts of sexual functioning, and kind of how they can be more at ease with themselves. I used to think that women were the ones with the sexual anxiety and that men were all set, and that's just not true. I mean, men and women, especially growing up in the church, we often take in the idea that sexuality is very suspect, that we have something to apologize for our sexuality, although men and women may relate to that apology in different ways. Men can be higher desire partners sometimes, but that's not the same thing as really being at peace with one's sexuality. And so, PE and delayed orgasm are often indicators, or erectile dysfunction for that matter, can very much be indicators of managing a lot of anxiety about your sexuality, about your sense of self, and about your relationship, ways that women also struggle, but with just different expressions. Anyway, it's a very good course. Okay, let me get back. I may come back to these here for a minute. Somebody's saying the quality of my relationship is so poor. I've mentally, emotionally, and sexually shut down. He's verbally and emotionally abusive. I still feel guilt over avoiding sex with him because I know he wants it, but the idea of giving myself to him physically makes me feel ill. Yeah, for good reason, it sounds like. I won't spend a lot of time on that, but if you're in a situation in which it's unsafe and unwise to open yourself up, it's very important to listen to that and to not... the guilt is more a function of the anxiety that if I don't capitulate, that, it will go badly for me. But if you're in a relationship in which you're being devalued, then it's very important to not participate in that for your own safety, your own psychological safety, for the sake of kids. If they're in that situation, it's very important to see what it is and to protect yourself in it. Okay, let me go back to this question here. Let's see. One thing I just want to say before I forget to say is, on average, it takes women 20 minutes of direct clitoral stimulation to climax. Now, I think the more relaxed a woman is, the more there's a pilot light kind of going on all the time in the marriage, which is ideal. If there's a lot of flirting and positive sexual tension that's happening in the marriage in the day-to-day, I don't think it necessarily takes that long. But men can climax with active thrusting on average, takes about 5.5 minutes, right? If you're basing a woman's arousal and orgasm on men's schedule, then it makes women look defective, and that's just the wrong picture. The right picture is that men can get aroused quickly, but a good lover, a man who's a good lover, gets better and better at integrating that sensation so he can stay in a servicing position, so to speak, for longer, and can work with the schedule of the woman. That is, so that he's better at holding a lot more sexual tension and energy, and being able to give lots of pleasure and sensuality to her as her body warms up. This is like an important and adaptive period of time. And so don't make the mistake of judging female sexuality by male sexuality. You want to think about, how do we create a partnership given how we're different as men and women. So if you're taking 30 minutes, you're not far off average, okay? And you can think about, are there ways that I can increase just the level of arousal before I engage with my spouse, or the ways that I'm thinking, or what I'm wearing, or, like women can do things like put on lingerie or sexy underwear or something before they even have contact with their spouse, because it's already increasing their sense of sexual desirability, their arousal level. So there's a lot of ways you can work with yourself in important ways as a woman. So it's not just like, okay, here I am, make it happen. Okay, not a good strategy. Doesn't work for men, doesn't work for women. Your husband doesn't give you the orgasm. You seduce your own orgasm with his help, with his assistance, with his care for you. Okay, this person says, "Hi, I've never had an orgasm and I know of, but I'm thinking I'd like to try. I just got done reading Come As You Are, so I know the steps I would need to take. My issue is that I have a lot of hesitancy masturbating because of the church's guidelines I learned as a youth. I think it's probably fine, but I can't quite get myself to let go of that idea that I'm not doing what I should be. When I told my husband that to learn how to orgasm I would need to masturbate to figure it out, he was pretty negative about the idea because of the church's teachings. So that made me even more hesitant to do it. I hate the idea of doing something my husband would look down on." So what I would say, let me first give the rationale for why one would want to touch herself to learn to orgasm, and then I can speak to this question specifically. The idea is that anxiety works against arousal. And so if you feel performance anxiety, and you feel like your spouse's hand is cramping or tired, whatever, and you're kind of loaded with self-judgment, and that's going to be a hard context in which to orgasm. I'm not saying it's impossible or that couples can't figure out a way to do it. Lots of couples do, but it's a challenge. It's a more challenging context, and most people, developmentally speaking, figure it out on their own first. Then bring it into partnership. So it's a more challenging context. The other piece of it that's challenging is not just the presence of another mind, but also if it's your spouse's, it's one thing if your spouse is there and you touch yourself and you can handle that. I think that works very well. But that control of the quality and quantity and type of touch, that's a little bit harder to manage if you're trying to tell your spouse what to do and he's not quite understanding it because you don't even quite understand it. So it's just hard. It's just hard to do. And I understand some people may feel really clear that God does not want them to touch their own genitals and that this would be a sin no matter what the purpose of it. And I think if you believe that, you should stay true to it. So I certainly don't want to encourage people to do something that they genuinely feel clear is sinful or wrong for them. But I think that one of the meaning challenges that I feel in this that I think is important to kind of think through is that it's not only so first of all, the way I see it is that God has given the individual her or his sexuality. And we have sort of a cultural meaning, which is like that my sexuality belongs to my future spouse. And I think that is a problematic meaning that creates a lot of resentments and is the wrong structural setup for good sexuality. Intimacy is I belong to myself. I belong to, my sexuality, my body is mine, and I choose and want to share myself with you and create something good with you. So I have more of an issue with the idea, it doesn't even really matter. Lots of people learn how to orgasm without ever touching themselves. My issue is not that people should touch themselves per se, but the reason why one doesn't is often exactly the meanings that interfere with good couples sexuality. And that is this idea that my genitals are half my husband's, or, only legitimate. My sexuality is only legitimate if it's gratifying him in some way, rather than I have a stewardship, a gift of embodiment and sexuality. And what am I creating and doing with that gift? And is it creating strength in me and strength in my partnership? Right? Because the meaning of, there's a very different meaning of reading sexual novels, masturbating in the basement, and thinking about the neighbor, okay? That's a very different meaning than I want to be in an accepting and peaceful relationship with myself and create a good marriage, okay? That I want to come to peace with my sexuality and stop being ashamed of it. That I want to learn how to care for myself and value myself, and accept my genitals, for example. Because a lot of people are in enormous amounts of shame and self-rejection and then wanting their spouse to be the one who solves that shame and self-rejection. And the spouse can't be the one, even if they fully accept you. If you haven't come to peace with who you are, you're not going to be able to integrate and receive that acceptance and that care. And so, there's lots of times where men are like, my wife is beautiful. She is so beautiful. I love her so much. And I'm sure that it's true, but she can't receive it because she doesn't yet see herself properly. She hasn't yet come to a place of peace within herself. So, again, I don't want anyone to do anything that they really believe is wrong. It's very important for you to take anything I say and to hold it up against your honesty and your conscience. But I think sometimes we're too legalistic and behaviorally focused in our moral thinking, and not enough about, does this create greater love, acceptance, capacity for intimacy, capacity for joy. That's what we're going for, not self-betrayal, because you can self-betray by touching yourself and you can self-betray by not doing it. So what are you actually creating in your choices? Those are very important questions for living by the spirit of the law. Okay, let me just take on question number 3, and then I'll see if there's time for other questions. So this person says, my husband and I have been married for close to 2 years, and I just haven't been able to orgasm. There have been a few times where I felt close, but it feels like it's taking too long and I give up. Other times I feel like I just get bored, so I'll get turned on, and that's about it. I'm taking the Art of Desire course, so I'm hoping that will help me work through things, but just want to hear from people who have also struggled and got through it. What helped? I also am grossed out receiving oral sex. I'm happy to give it to my husband and have been getting more into it, but I really just think it's gross when he goes down on me. It's really just me and he has no issues. I don't want to kiss him after unless he uses mouthwash. I know this is probably the big issue I need to work through to orgasm, but just need some support on what works and helps to get through it. I want to enjoy sex for me, not just for my husband, but getting more and more frustrated with it the longer it takes to figure it out. Regarding my husband, he really wants me to orgasm and will focus completely on me if needed, but I'm rarely interested. Okay, good question, and I'm glad you have the Art of Desire course. It will definitely help you. I think that this is just one of the most awesome things about men and sexuality is the kind of their tolerance for gross and the generosity that's a part of so many men's sexual and masculine gifts, right? And so meaning like when she's saying that he really wants me to orgasm and he'll focus on me completely if needed, that, some people might say, well, that's just because he wants to feel successful and it's all selfish. And I don't think that's fair. I think that there really is that many men love to be able to bring pleasure and to bless their wives through sexual generosity. And oftentimes the stopping point is the woman's sense of self and self-acceptance. Because this woman is clear, like, he's fine with me. He's fine having his mouth on my genitals. I can't handle the idea of it. I feel so much self-rejection, and can I handle this part of me? And so I think that this is a woman who is, so first of all, let me just say this just to be a little bit compassionate towards people. Some people are a little more anxious and can have high sensitivity to gross. By gross, I'm saying, genital fluids and all those things. And others have much less, okay? And so this isn't just about one's personal development. It may be that for some it takes a little bit more to kind of be open to body fluids and open to the kind of the stickiness and all of that, right? And so for some it takes a little more self-regulation to do it. But I think a core question here is this question of self-acceptance that's really fundamental to sexuality. And, that my husband actually loves and accepts me more than I love and accept me. That's what it feels like. And so it's about, let me just see, there's something else that she wrote before. I just want to see, there are a few times I felt close, but I feel like it's taking too long. So it feels like it's taking too long. And what I kind of hear in that is this kind of self-judgment that's coming in. I'm too long. I think a question is, well, how much time are you worth? And how are you going to relate to that question? It sounds like you have a husband who wants you to take up your half. and to be given to and to be loved and physically valued, and that it feels to me that the woman writing this question is struggling a bit to take up her half, take up her space, to let herself be given to let herself feel cherished and adored, and in a good way, not in a pedestalized way, kind of sexually worshipped, okay? That he wants to kiss you and love you in this way. He wants to touch you and give pleasure to you in this way. That it's transcendent for him, and he's hoping to bring you into that same transcendence. And it sounds like just the self-doubt and the fear is kind of putting the brakes on. And that's normal. And that's normal from a developmental perspective. And I think what helps is challenging your relationship to yourself, how you want to be in relationship to yourself, which is very much what the Art of Desire course is helping you think about, but not through, excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. I should do this. If I were a grown-up woman, I would be fine with this. That's not going to help you to think like that, but instead to think in terms of, am I going to let kind of my fear or my anxiety sort of stop something more beautiful and more open-hearted from happening? Am I going to let, my husband, who I think has good judgment, thinks I'm beautiful, thinks it's worth putting his mouth on my genitals, okay? Can I be okay with myself? Can I accept myself more? And, I'm not saying you have to let him kiss you right afterwards. You can make your decisions about that. But I think it's more when you're challenging, like, how do I want to be in relationship to my strength, to my beauty, to my sexuality? Do I want to be in a kind of self-reducing frame, or do I want to look for creating deeper freedom inside of me? So again, going back to that initial idea, is that women's sexual desire and pleasure is highly linked to the feeling of freedom. And this is as much a way a woman relates to herself as it is a way a man relates to a woman. So am I relating to myself in a way that's expansive, that brings that Eros energy into my life, that gives me joy, that makes room for me and my gifts, not at the expense of others, but also not compromising, who I am at the expense of myself either. And so am I living in a way to feel alive, to feel valuable, to feel like a real partner to my spouse? And even if I'm working through some anxieties, I'm invested in creating that reality with him, or telling him what I would like more, or what would make it more pleasurable for me, or what's something he could say to me, or something we could do so that I'm not getting bored, but I'm staying more easily engaged. So it's a collaborative process, but it's coming from a woman who's saying, I am half of this, and I feel anxious about that, but I know it's right for me to push myself in this way. And I know for myself in the first year of marriage or so, I think struggled in this way a little bit. Like, I almost wanted to be less invested and be in a little bit more step back position because I was afraid to lean in, afraid to really let my husband have a meaningful impact on me, afraid to be a woman fully capable of receiving it, easier to be in self-judgment, judge, my body, those kinds of things, than to just say, you know what? I'm good enough. and I'm not going to do that to myself. And I can just open my heart up and step into the freedom of loving and being loved. And so that's an important developmental and psychological shift. So we just have a couple of minutes. Let me just see if people are asking questions. Yeah, let's see. This person says, when I think I'm having an orgasm, it feels like there's a wall and it's almost painful and not satisfactory at all. What's happening and how do I overcome this? It feels, I don't know, and I certainly would encourage you, if you haven't already, to go to a doctor and just make sure that there's not any kind of physical realities. But it sounds like that it's a psychological barrier of some kind. And I've certainly worked with clients who have that, some that have come out of sexual trauma, and there's just a wall. It's like the limbic mind has made a decision that this is not safe to be sexual, and so we're helping you out by making sure you never have sexual experience again. or, you know, another client that was in a coercive sexual relationship before she got married, and her mind just literally just shut it off as a kind of self-protective thing. Doing embodied therapies like EMDR, for example, if there's any kind of, and it doesn't even have to be an overt sexual trauma, it can be coming out of, you know, I had a client, she had no overt sexual trauma, but she came out of a household where sexuality was so shamed. And she was taught that if you're a good woman, you don't have sex. So her whole body basically was supporting her belief. And she had vaginismus. She didn't have her first intercourse for several years because her whole body shut down. And she was a girl that, you know, in her youth had masturbated a lot. So this was not like a woman who didn't know sexuality at all. But her body just went into a self-protective, you know, again, we want to belong to ourselves more than be sexual. In her family of origin, belonging to herself was to not be sexual. And so her body worked in line with that belief and shut it all down. It wasn't until she learned how to reject that messaging, to see the pressure that her family system was putting on her psychologically, and to reject it consciously and deliberately. She worked with a pelvic floor therapist and worked with her body's reactivity and worked with the meanings around it. And, you know, and then in not much time started having both intercourse and orgasms again, because she was now working in a different meaning that her body could feel safe in opening up to. I mean, the amazing thing is how much the body is in response to the meanings. Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, a lot of questions about anxiety and depression impacting the ability to be aroused. Thank you, Chrissy. Yeah, so I think that's true, and especially SSRIs, so that there's more serotonin in the brain, that can, I mean, some people just are more sensitive to serotonin, so they may have delayed orgasm, like men may have delayed orgasm. So, yeah, so sometimes, I'm just thinking if I was saying that the right way. So in premature orgasm, sometimes men will take a short-acting SSRI so that there's more serotonin in their brain, which actually stops them from orgasming so quickly. So if you are taking an SSRI, it will have a suppressing effect on orgasm and arousal. One way to address this is, I can't remember, there's SNRIs, there is Wellbutrin, which is a different, I'm not a psychiatrist, I don't know these like a psychiatrist would. Wellbutrin is one of the antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds that has less of an effect on the entire body. Now, some research shows that daily aerobic exercise has as much positive impact as a low-dose SSRI or a low-dose antidepressant. So it might be working with your doctor a little bit to see, like, is there some way that you can calibrate and bring down those levels while knowing that you're going to do an exercise regimen, like, because exercise is very much something that will increase arousal. It's in sort of engaging in your embodiment, feeling better about your body, just greater health is very much linked to better sexual functioning. So if there's some way to calibrate that you have enough antidepressant to make it work when you're doing regular exercise, that can certainly have a positive effect. What I would also say is there can be the paradoxical effect of, if you are so depressed and anxious that you have no arousal and desire, sometimes taking an antidepressant and or exercising becomes the way to actually start to have desire, because you're getting out of that, you know, pit of self-rejection. But your doctor is going to be a better one to talk to around it. I don't know how much progress they've made on that front, but yes, the serotonin, which often can work against depression, is also going to work against arousal and orgasm. That said, the belief that it's going to work against it may be even more powerful. So lots of people on antidepressants are having lots of orgasms. So if you think, oh my gosh, I'm not going to have, you know, when I started to go through menopause about a year ago, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to have sexual desire again. It's going to go away. And just like I went through a bit of panic because I was just, I think, grieving that I was somebody who could be capable of menopause and afraid. And so there was just like a period of a few weeks where it was just like my own fear of it was suppressing my sexual response. And then I just I don't know. I just worked my way out of it and I was like, no, it's fine. There's still a lot one can do with themselves to create sexual arousal and desire if they let themselves. And, we can take it up in another Facebook Live, but, a lot of times the things that we're thinking about, what are the thoughts, what are the ideas? There's a lot we can do to work with our bodies to create arousal, especially if we don't feel conflicted about that. But if you're on an antidepressant and you feel conflicted about being sexual at all, those two together can really work against creating the arousal that you want. Okay, let me just see. Let me just see if there's something. This is in the Art of Loving live course last Saturday. My father-in-law walked in the room. Oh gosh, right when you were talking about vibrators and using them. I've never seen him try to leave a place so fast. That was awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, so for delayed orgasm, men can also get vibrators. Thanks for bringing up vibrators, because I didn't say anything about that for women too. So there, you can get a vibrator that goes right at the frenulum, which is the most sensitive part of the penis. If especially as men are aging, they may. I'm just thinking about your father-in-law. That's so funny. My father-in-law, once I had him print some stuff for the Art of Desire when I couldn't get it to print. I was at my mother-in-law's house, and so he's like, no, I can do it for you. Just send me the document. I'm like, okay, so it's the session 5. There's like a big picture of a vulva. So he's printing it, just hands it to me very respectfully, but it was like, okay, thank you. But anyway, okay, so let me see, the vibrator. So you can get a vibrator for the penis, especially as men age. Their nerve sensitivity can lessen, and so it may make delayed orgasm more likely. So increasing how direct that stimulation is, either through the wife or husband, giving direct contact to the penis, but also a vibrator can be great. And then for women, often women have their first orgasms with a vibrator. And, some people love vibration, other people don't like vibration very much, but there's a lot of good vibrators on the market that can be controlled for intensity and speed. And, some people like just a tiny bit of vibration, some people want a lot. But there's a lot of ways that you can, some women, it's almost like it's just enough that whatever inhibitory reality they have, it's just a way of getting them over that edge, in a sense, and starting to have more confidence in their ability to orgasm. And then if they want to increase the repertoire of how they get to that orgasm threshold, they can. The We Vibe is a good one for some women that with intercourse, because it will stimulate both the G spot and the kind of the outer clitoris. And it accommodates a man in intercourse so that there's enough stimulation there, because some women don't get enough clitoral stimulation with intercourse. That's a really good one. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones that, just anything that you can just go down to Home Depot and get like a regular vibrator. So it just the dryer, okay. Any vibration, the shower head can certainly be a helpful form of stimulation for some women. Okay. Let's see. All right. So I'll come back to some of these questions. Kissing is one of the largest turn-ons for me, for sure. And one thing is that women, there's more nerve endings in the lips, and you're more able to map the mind of your partner through kissing than you are through intercourse. So kissing is actually more intimate. And kissing, well, for some reason, a lot of couples give that up, and just after all the years of making out before they got married, and then they just want to skip past all of that lovemaking that happens through the rest of the body. And it's a big mistake, because there's so much intimacy and connection and meaning that gets created, but it's also part of preparing a woman's body for the capacity to have an orgasm, and even an orgasm with intercourse. The statistics on orgasm with intercourse are like around 30% for women. And I understand that there's an anatomical reality for some women, which is the clitoral head is more than an inch away from the vaginal opening. The research shows that woman would have a little bit harder time orgasming with intercourse. So I know that that's a reality, but I also wonder if part of what's happening is women just haven't had enough opportunity to get highly aroused before intercourse, because they're not getting good foreplay. And I don't mean just that the men are just doing a bad job. They may also be complicit in not having the intimacy of that foreplay. But to have, I don't know if I say too much about my own life, but in my own life, there's just like a lot of touching that's going on, and a lot of touching that goes on before we ever get to intercourse. And it's you know, a part of that just overall deep integration of arousal, but also it means that the level of arousal is much, much higher. So there's a much better chance of orgasm with intercourse because you don't have far to go. So, okay. So thanks everybody. I'll come back to the group and see other questions that are there and see if I can answer them. Great. So thanks so much everybody, and I will see you in a month. Bye.